Night in a medieval castle was not a simple pause in daily activity. It was a distinct physical reality shaped by tons of stone, wood, and iron. Before the invention of electricity, darkness inside a fortress was a thick, enveloping veil. A single tallow candle could barely illuminate a radius of 3 meters, leaving the rest of a chamber in impenetrable gloom. Granite and limestone walls possessed thermal properties that turned interiors into refrigerators, absorbing body heat and dropping temperatures to near freezing during winter months. The architecture itself dictated the experience of the night. Walls exceeding 2 meters in thickness created bubbles of absolute solitude, where a shout in the courtyard was reduced to an inaudible murmur inside. The passage of time was measured by the changing of the guard and the slow movement of moonlight across stone floors. This video explores the historical reality of spending a solitary night in a medieval castle. It examines the physics of darkness, the acoustic phenomena of stone halls, and the daily routines that governed life after sunset. The history of the Middle Ages is often told through battles and kings, but the night reveals a different side of medieval life. It was a time of architectural breathing, thermal contrasts, and strict routines designed for survival. The moment the last torch was extinguished plunged the fortress into a total sensory abyss. The resulting darkness was a measure of collective survival. The following chapters detail the materials, the temperatures, and the sounds that fill the fortress after the sun set. The history is presented as it was, grounded in the physical properties of the materials and the documented practices of the era. The night had its own weight, measured in the slow cooling of stone and the quiet burning of a beeswax candle. The exploration begins with the nature of light and darkness inside the stone walls. Welcome. Tonight, we are looking at the historical reality of a medieval castle after sunset. It is a topic that is often surrounded by romantic ideas, but the actual history is deeply rooted in the physics of materials and daily survival. A fortress was built to withstand attacks, but it also had to withstand the harshness of the natural elements. Spending a solitary night inside one of these massive stone structures was a direct encounter with extreme cold, absolute darkness, and monumental architecture. We will examine how people lived within tons of solid rock, how they measured time without modern clocks, and how the building itself physically changed during the long night. The narration will walk through the details of stone, iron, and wood as they reacted to the drop in temperature. If this detailed look at history is what you are looking for, you can subscribe to the channel today. Let us begin with the nature of darkness inside the stone walls. Darkness and light. The darkness within a medieval fortress was not merely the absence of sunlight. It was a physical presence, a thick veil that enveloped everything and forced a complete reliance on limited artificial light. The quality of the light illuminating the night depended directly on animal chemistry and available resources. Tallow candles, made from rendered cow or sheep fat, were the most common source of illumination for the majority of the inhabitants. These candles burned at a low temperature and produced thick smoke, along with a lingering smell of burnt fat that permeated the room. The incomplete combustion of the tallow released carbon particles that remained suspended in the air, reducing visibility and giving the atmosphere a pungent odor. In contrast, beeswax candles were reserved for the nobility and the clergy. Beeswax melted at around 62 degrees Celsius, emitting a whiter, more stable light that was almost smokeless. The sweet aroma of pure beeswax transformed the space into a more pleasant environment. The difference between luxury and survival in a medieval castle was often measured by the scent that wafted through the gloom and the quality of the light that pierced it. For those who could not afford even tallow candles, reed candles served as the primary measure of time and light. These were dried reeds soaked in animal fat, which burned at a constant rate of approximately 20 minutes per unit. Their light was dim and flickering, projecting an unsteady shadow that moved across the room as the reed consumed itself. When the flame reached the green tip of the reed, the darkness reclaimed its territory. It was a clock made of fire and plant matter. The flickering light of a single beeswax candle cast shadows of the wooden beams and furniture that seemed to have a life of their own. The flame, moved by the slightest invisible drafts, caused the shadows to stretch and shrink rhythmically, creating an optical illusion of perpetual motion. The corners of the room seemed to move closer and farther away, blurring the true dimensions of the space. The fear of fire was a constant shadow that dictated strict nightly routines. Because much of the upper floors and roofs were made of dry wood, a single lapse in attention could consume an entire tower in less than 2 hours. A designated marshal was responsible for extinguishing all torches and braziers before midnight, leaving only carefully controlled embers. The moment the last light went out, plunged the fortress into a total sensory abyss. This darkness was not merely a lack of light, but a critical measure of collective survival. In this absolute blackness, the human eye underwent a profound physiological adaptation. After 40 minutes without light, the regeneration of rhodopsin in the retinal rods reached its peak sensitivity. In this state, the light of a single candle could theoretically be detected from over a kilometer away. The chemistry of vision transformed blindness into a heightened perception of contours, turning the castle's gloom into a landscape of grays where shadows acquired volume. Peering through the narrow slit of a bow window offered an unfiltered spectacle of astronomy. Free from any modern light pollution, the Milky Way was so bright it cast faint shadows on the stone floor. Gazing at thousands of stars shining in the void induced profound contemplation. It was a silent connection with the cosmos that contrasted sharply with the earthly confinement of the stone walls. The light of the full moon did not enter through the windows as a diffuse beam. Instead, it projected through the arrow slits in sharp, precise lines. Depending on the angle of the slit and the position of the moon, the silvery beam of light traveled across the stone floor at an imperceptible speed, tracing a path about 10 centimeters wide. This cold beam illuminated the specks of dust suspended in the air, creating a microcosm of particles dancing in the darkness. It was a silent geometry that measured the passage of the night with astronomical accuracy. The astronomical alignment of the tower's arrow slits was not accidental. Medieval architects aligned certain slits with the position of specific stars on key dates in the agricultural calendar, allowing the light from stars like Sirius or the Pleiades to penetrate at precise moments of the year. The precision of these openings, with a margin of error of barely 2 degrees, transformed the fortress into a rudimentary observatory. The North Star, with its fixed declination, projected its light through a north-facing slit, creating a motionless point of light on the chamber floor. This celestial anchor remained unmoved despite the Earth's rotation. The last glimmer of the moon before it disappeared behind the battlements passed through the window slit at a grazing angle, casting the shadow of the stone onto the opposite wall. This sharp, black shadow moved vertically at a speed of approximately 1 centimeter per second, covering the limestone wall until it was plunged into total darkness. The moonlight inside the chambers was not perceived as white or silver. Due to a phenomenon known as the Purkinje effect, the human eye, adapted to darkness, interpreted the moonlight as a deep blue. This occurred because the rod photoreceptors, responsible for night vision, were more sensitive to the shorter wavelengths of the light spectrum. Under this scotopic light, the red tapestries appeared almost black, while the blues and greens stood out with spectral brilliance. The retina's chemistry painted the night with brushstrokes of cool blue. The color of the moonlight reflected inside the castle also varied, depending on the material of the walls. The white limestone, with an albedo of up to 30%, returned a bluish, ghostly glow that illuminated the corners with a spectral coldness. In contrast, the dark granite absorbed most of the light, creating pools of absolute shadow that contrasted sharply with the glimmers of the light stone. This chromatic duality divided the room into territories of light and darkness. The windows of the private chambers were sometimes sealed with sheets of polished animal hide or pig bladder, which altered the spectrum of outside light. These translucent materials possessed a refractive index that filtered out the shorter wavelengths, allowing only yellowish and reddish tones to pass through. Moonlight, as it pierced these organic membranes, lost its cool blue hue and was tinged with a warm, sickly glow that distorted the colors of the room. The transparent horn windows, sheets of delaminated and polished cow horn that covered some kitchen openings, had a refractive index of approximately 1.5. This bent the light rays at a different angle than glass, creating ghostly, distorted images of the moon that drifted across the walls like liquid shadows. The dripping candle wax formed an unwitting clock of matter and gravity. Each drop of beeswax, weighing approximately 0.2 grams, fell from the flame to the bronze candlestick at intervals of about 12 minutes, solidifying upon contact with the cold metal. The accumulation of wax formed miniature geological structures, layers of organic material that tangibly recorded the passage of time. Counting the solidified drops was a method of measuring the night in units of wax. The flame of a candle in a drafty room flickered at a frequency of approximately 5 Hz, creating a hypnotic oscillation. The convection of rising warm air and descending cool air caused the flame to tilt and stretch, projecting dancing shadows that distorted the room's dimensions. This luminous, unsteady, rhythmic oscillation was the heartbeat of combustion struggling against the invisible wind. Clothes, moths, and other nocturnal butterflies that slipped in through windows experienced a fatal navigational confusion. Evolutionarily programmed to maintain a constant angle relative to the moonlight, the nearby candle acted as a deceptive beacon, forcing them to fly in ever-tightening spirals. This phenomenon, known as positive phototaxis, invariably ended with the insect colliding with the flame or landing on the melted wax. The sound of its wings against the candle was a dry, brittle scraping, a whisper of scales abruptly cut short. The extinguishing of a tallow candle did not end its presence in the room. As the flame went out, unburned fatty acids began to crystallize at room temperature, emitting a thick, greasy odor that clung to stone and wood surfaces. This aroma remained in the lower layers of the room for hours, an olfactory reminder of the light that was no longer there. The candle's shadow became visible to the sense of smell. The reflection of a candle flame on the varnished surface of a wooden chest created an optical illusion of depth. The light, striking the layer of dried wax or oil that protected the wood, was reflected specularly, creating a second flame that seemed to float inside the piece. This double image, shimmering and golden, deceived the eyes, suggesting a fire trapped beneath the wood. The ashes accumulated in the hearth were not an inert residue, but a highly reactive alkaline powder. Composed largely of potassium carbonate, the ash absorbed moisture from the air and released a dry, caustic odor that permeated the base of the chimney. The night's combustion left a greasy trail that accumulated the history of each candle burned. The cold of stone. The cold inside a medieval castle was a constant companion, a reality dictated by the thermal properties of the stone. The granite or limestone walls had a high capacity for absorbing heat, causing the interior temperature of a chamber to drop to 4 degrees Celsius in the dead of winter, even with a fire burning. It was a damp cold that clung to clothing and seeped into the bones, forcing the inhabitants to wrap themselves in several layers of heavy wool. The stone acted as a natural refrigerator, sucking away any trace of body heat. This thermal contrast meant that the simple act of breathing produced a small, visible puff of vapor. The thermal mass of the castle walls created a delayed heat cycle that defied intuition. The limestone, with a specific heat capacity of approximately 900 joules per kilogram Kelvin, absorbed the sun's heat during the day and released it with a delay of up to 6 hours. This meant that the peak temperature inside the chamber was reached well past midnight, long after the sun had set. The wall returned the day's heat like a belated whisper, a thermal phantom that embraced the room when the outside was already frozen. The Lord's private chamber, known as the solar, was located at the very top of the keep. This status symbol contained a stark thermal paradox. Being above the courtyard level, it was exposed to the crosswinds that battered the building at over 100 kilometers per hour on stormy nights. The thin walls on the upper floors, designed to maximize space and light, meant less thermal insulation. Hierarchical supremacy came at the price of the most penetrating cold and the most direct wind noise. The height brought one closer to the sky, but also to the harshness of winter. The stone walls of varying thickness within the same chamber created microclimates that divided the room into distinct thermal zones. The outer wall, 2.5 meters thick, maintained a surface temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, while the inner wall, barely 80 centimeters thick, could reach 9 degrees. This 5-degree difference created convection currents within the room, a slow airflow that moved from the warm wall to the cold in a silent cycle. The physiological response to the extreme cold of the chamber activated shivering thermogenesis, an involuntary survival mechanism. Skeletal muscles contracted and relaxed rapidly, up to 10 times per second, in an attempt to generate heat by expending energy. This imperceptible movement produced a rustling of tissues and a subtle chattering of teeth that disturbed the stillness of the bed. The body fought against the cold of the stone with its own internal combustion. The thermal radiation from the human body inside a chamber at 4 degrees Celsius created an invisible heat field that extended approximately half a meter in all directions. This infrared halo, emitted at a wavelength of approximately 9 micrometers, heated a thin layer of air surrounding the skin before being absorbed by the cold stone. Someone sleeping wrapped in wool generated a heat bubble of barely 1 cubic meter, an ephemeral thermal island that dissolved with the slightest movement. The body was a living furnace attempting to heat an ocean of granite. The sleeping arrangements were designed to combat this cold. The heavy wool curtains hanging from the bed's canopy not only blocked drafts, but also created a microclimate of trapped air. The wool fabric, with a thermal conductivity of a mere 40 milliwatts per meter Kelvin, acted as a barrier, retaining body heat within a volume of approximately 2 cubic meters. Inside this textile cocoon, the temperature could be 6 degrees higher than that of the room, creating an abrupt sensory contrast upon waking. The canopy was a room within a room, a fabric refuge within the stone fortress. The wool blankets and bear or wolf skins covering the bed were not just warmth, but a considerable mass of weight. An accumulation of several layers of heavy wool could exert a pressure of several kilograms on the body, creating a sensation of sinking and physical containment. This weight, evenly distributed, induced an involuntary muscle relaxation response. The bed became a crushing yet secure refuge from the cold. The doors to the private chambers were not simple wooden planks, but solid oak barriers, reinforced with wrought iron bands. A 5-centimeter thick oak leaf offered remarkable thermal resistance. The weight of that wood, which could exceed 150 kilos, transformed the act of isolating the room into a tangible physical effort. The drawbridge chains were covered with a thin layer of condensation that altered their weight and sound. Water vapor from the moat, upon contact with the cold iron, condensed into millimeter-sized droplets that accumulated on the links, adding weight and modifying the chain's vibration frequency. The iron chains of the drawbridge, supporting tons of wood and metal, settled under their own weight in the early morning. The tension accumulated during the day redistributed itself through the links, emitting a deep, metallic groan that lasted several seconds and resonated throughout the gate structure. The iron plate armor left on guard in a corner underwent a profound condensation process as the temperature dropped. Upon reaching the dew point, the water vapor in the air condensed onto the cold metal, coating the plates with a thin layer of moisture. This physical transformation of the metal evidenced the midnight temperature drop. The lime mortar that bound the enormous stone blocks was not an inert material, but a chemical entity that breathed with the night. As the relative humidity increased, the slaked lime slowly reacted with the carbon dioxide in the air in a process called carbonation. This reaction released an earthy, alkaline aroma, a smell of damp stone dust that emanated from the joints of the walls. The slaked lime coating the interior walls had a pH of approximately 12.5, creating a chemically alkaline environment that inhibited the growth of mold and bacteria. The fortress, in its innermost structure, was being built and solidifying while everyone slept. The building grew silently, embraced by the darkness, sound inside the walls. The sound insulation provided by the thick walls of a medieval castle created a bubble of absolute solitude. With walls exceeding 2.5 meters in thickness at the base, a shout in the courtyard outside was reduced to an inaudible murmur within the chamber. This architecturally induced deafness made the isolation feel like a physical layer, separating the individual from the rest of the known world. The solitude was not only emotional, but an acoustic reality where the only truly close sound was one's own heartbeat. It was a dense silence, heavy with the weight of the stone. The keep cast an acoustic shadow over the lower parts of the castle. Its limestone mass, exceeding 10 meters in diameter at its base, blocked low-frequency sound waves traveling from outside, creating a zone of relative silence behind it. The sounds of the distant forest or the river were intercepted and absorbed by the density of the wall. Anyone sleeping in the tower's shadow experienced an artificial stillness, a sonic void carved into the rock. The echo in the castle's main hall had a reverberation time that could reach a full 4 seconds. The absence of tapestries on the bare stone walls and the flagstone floors meant that the sound bounced around unimpeded, multiplying into an acoustic cascade. A simple cough or the rustling of fabric transformed into a whisper that expanded throughout the hall, reminding one of the vastness of empty space. The human voice lost its clarity, becoming a murmur that lingered. This phenomenon made absolute silence almost impossible to achieve. The barrel vault of the main hall acted as an acoustic lens, concentrating sound at its highest point. Sound waves, originating from the floor of the hall, rose up the curved walls and converged at the keystone of the vault, where they were amplified before descending again. This meant that a whisper uttered beneath the central arch could be clearly heard at the opposite end of the hall, while a shout from a meter away was inaudible. Gothic architecture was an acoustics laboratory, an echo tube carved in stone. The passage of time during the night was measured by the noise of the guards patrolling the inner courtyard. The changing of the guard occurred every 3 hours, marked by the rhythmic clatter of leather boots and plate armor against the cobblestones. The sound echoed off the 4 walls of the courtyard, creating a manifold reverberation that filtered in through the narrow arrow-slit windows. It was a heavy, metallic tapping, a confirmation that the fortress remained awake and vigilant. This rhythm marked the phases of the night with military precision. The footsteps of the sentry patrolling the outer wall sounded different depending on the surface he trod. On the granite cobblestones of the courtyard, his leather boots with wooden soles produced a sharp, dry impact of about 80 decibels that echoed off the walls for 3 seconds. As he stepped onto the wooden walkways of the ramparts, the sound shifted to a deeper, more resonant frequency, amplified by the air chamber beneath the planks. The wind that lashed against the battlements was not just heard, it was felt in the very structure of the building. Fortresses were built on strategic elevations, exposed to air currents that could reach speeds of up to 80 kilometers per hour. As the wind struck the towers, it generated a low-frequency vibration, a continuous hum of around 50 hertz that reverberated through the 2-meter-thick walls. It was a deep, constant sound, like the purring of a giant animal asleep underground. This vibration was transmitted to the floor and the bed, making the night a physically resonant experience. The wind passing through the embrasures and the battlements generated a pattern of turbulence that depended on the speed and angle of incidents. At a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the air passing through a 10-centimeter wide slit created alternating eddies that detached at a frequency of approximately 100 hertz. This pattern produced a deep, undulating musical tone, like that of a broken flute played by emptiness. The battlements were a wind organ carved into the rock. The spiral staircases of the keep towers were not only a defensive design, but also an acoustic conduit that redirected sound. Built clockwise, they favored right-handed defenders, but their spiral shape acted like a funnel, amplifying footsteps and echoes from the lower floors. A sound emitted at the base of the tower would twist and turn, reaching the upper chambers with a hollow, metallic resonance. The architecture itself was an instrument of listening. The helical shape of the shaft caused sound waves to travel in a spiral, reaching the upper floors with a phase shift that deceived the human ear, making it impossible to determine whether a footstep came from above or below. A sound emitted at the base was perceived at the top as an enveloping whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The stone steps of the spiral staircase, worn smooth by centuries of use, possessed a concavity that altered the acoustics of each step. The central depression of each step created a small resonating chamber that amplified the impact of the leather soles, giving each step a hollow, resonant sound. The sentry horn, used to mark the hour or warn of danger, emitted a fundamental note of approximately 110 hertz. This low frequency was specifically designed to travel long distances through the thick, cold air of early morning, overcoming the acoustic absorption of the fog. The horn's sound pierced the stone walls with a melancholic clarity, echoing across the surrounding valleys for miles. Each blast was a sonic thread that tied the fortress to the landscape beyond. The courtyard's inner well possessed its own resonant frequency, determined by the depth of its air column and the cylindrical shape of the conduit. A voice or an echo falling into it amplified the sound waves of around 200 hertz, returning a deep, watery murmur. The stagnant water at the bottom acted as a perfect sound reflector, creating an underground echo chamber. Throwing a stone into it unleashed a liquid roar that rose up the rock walls. The profound silence of the fortress at 4 in the morning allowed one to hear a sound that modern science has cataloged as a real phenomenon. In an environment with a noise level below 15 decibels, the human ear begins to perceive the spontaneous activity of the auditory nerve, an internal buzzing of approximately 7 kilohertz that does not originate from any external source. This phantom sound, called spontaneous tinnitus, was the voice of the nervous system itself, functioning in absolute stillness. The solitude of the castle allowed one to hear the sound of one's own flesh thinking. The extreme silence within the isolated chambers had a side effect on human physiology, the ability to hear one's own bodily sounds. In an environment with a background noise level below 20 decibels, The blood flow through the carotid arteries and the heartbeat become perceptible to the inner ear. This deep hum, similar to the passing of a subway train, filled the acoustic void of the room. The hourglass used to measure night watches in the keep suffered from a flow disturbance due to the viscosity of the cold air. The fine sand, with grains approximately half a millimeter in diameter, fell through the narrow glass neck at a speed dependent on friction with the air trapped inside. In sub-zero temperatures, the air became denser and more viscous, slowing the passage of the grains by about 3%, lengthening each hour of watch by almost 2 minutes. The night was being measured with an instrument that the night itself distorted. The drawbridge's winch mechanism, located in the upper chamber of the gate, produced a wood-on-wood sound that intensified in the cold. The winch, consisting of an oak cylinder approximately 1 meter in diameter, rotating on iron axles, creaked under the tension of the chains as the wood lost moisture and contracted around the metal axle. This forced adjustment generated a high-pitched, prolonged squeal that lasted several seconds, audible throughout the gate's structure. The call of an owl in the nearby forest filtered through the battlements with an altered acoustic quality. The acoustic impedance of the denser, cold air outside caused the sound waves at a frequency of approximately 500 Hz to travel faster and clearer, penetrating the stone walls like a sonic needle. The solitary, rhythmic hooting cut through the silence inside, a reminder that the castle was not alone in the landscape. The forest sent its voice through the stone. The sound of a distant river traveled with deceptive clarity into the fortress. During the night, a temperature inversion created a layer of cold air near the ground and warmer air aloft, acting as an acoustic conduit that made the murmur of water 3 kilometers away sound as if it were flowing alongside the walls. This deep sound, at approximately 40 Hz, filtered through the arrow slits, mingling with the silence inside. Sleep in the Middle Ages. The concept of an uninterrupted night's sleep is a relatively modern invention. In the Middle Ages, darkness was divided into 2 phases of rest, separated by a period of wakefulness of approximately 1 hour, a practice known as segmented sleep. During this dark pause, the mind awoke naturally, without alarm, in a state of neurochemical calm. People took advantage of this time to read, pray, or simply contemplate the shadows in the room. It was an interval of introspection where time seemed to stand still in the dense air of the chamber. The human body's circadian rhythm, deprived of the light signals that mark the natural cycle, slowly drifted into a state of free running. Without sunlight to synchronize the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus, melatonin production could begin up to 2 hours later each night, lengthening the internal cycle to 25 hours. The darkness of the castle decoupled the body from the sky, creating its own biological time that did not coincide with that of the stars. The night was not a structureless temporal void, but a map marked by the canonical hours of monastic prayer. Around 2 in the morning, the peal of a small bell from the inner chapel announced matins, breaking the silence with a vibration of 600 Hz. Gregorian chants, unbound by modern rhythmic meter, flowed in a free tempo that drifted through the stone corridors. That vocal music without instruments possessed a ghostly quality that calmed the vigil. It was the voice of faith measuring the depths of the early morning. Melatonin production in the sleeper's pineal gland reached its peak around 3 in the morning, in total darkness. This hormone, released in the absence of blue light, lowered the internal body temperature by approximately half a degree and reduced the heart rate by 5 or 6 beats per minute. The castle inhabitant's body, immersed in uninterrupted blackness, reached its state of lowest metabolic activity at a time when wakefulness and sleep blurred. The sleeping arrangements were not on firm surfaces, but rather on wooden frames with woven rope bases that supported straw or wool mattresses. With use, these ropes loosened, creating an imperfect hammock that needed to be tightened regularly to prevent falling to the ground. The hemp fibers creaked constantly with every movement, a dry squeak that betrayed each change of position. The ropes at the base of the mattress, woven from braided hemp 6 millimeters in diameter, lost tension unevenly with the nighttime humidity. Each rope, absorbing water vapor from the air, relaxed at a different rate depending on its proximity to the stone floor, creating an uneven sleeping surface that dipped in specific spots. The straw also attracted insects and mites, adding a touch of itchiness to the night. Even so, it was the only refuge from the cold of the cobblestone floor. The mice nesting inside the straw mattresses generated metabolic heat that altered the bed's temperature. A group of 5 or 6 mice huddled together inside the mattress could raise the local temperature by up to 3 degrees above the ambient temperature, creating a hot spot that the sleeper felt without understanding. The friction of their bodies against the straw produced a continuous, rasping, creaking sound that blended with the sound of the mattress itself. The bed harbored a hidden life that warmed and creaked in the darkness. The metal bed warmer, filled with embers and tucked between the sheets, lost its thermal effectiveness following an exponential decay curve. The brass container, cooling from its initial temperature of 200 degrees Celsius, transferred its heat to the bedding over approximately 3 hours, after which its temperature equalized with that of the mattress. The artificial heat dissipated, leaving a lukewarm area that the cold of the room inexorably demanded. The attic, or hanging latrine, was not only a waste conduit, but also an unwitting chemical factory. The urea present in urine, when decomposed by bacteria, released ammonia gas that rose through the chimney flue. This gas, with its acrid and pungent odor, was pragmatically used to whiten linen clothes hanging in the adjoining room. The ammonia dissolved the dirt and naturally clarified the textile fibers. The drafts that crept under the oak doors were the result of a complex aerodynamic effect. The pressure difference between the windswept courtyard outside and the chamber's interior created a gradient that forced air through the lower slit at a speed greater than that of the surroundings. This phenomenon, similar to Bernoulli's principle, generated a deep, continuous whistling sound that swept across the stone floor. The bread dough, left to ferment in the cold pantry, underwent a biological dormancy that altered its final structure. The yeasts present in the dough, at a temperature of about 6 degrees Celsius, reduced their metabolic activity to a fraction of their normal rate, producing carbon dioxide at a barely perceptible speed. This extreme fermentation resulted in a loaf with a dense crumb and irregular air pockets. The apples stored in the pantry continued to respire throughout the night, consuming oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide and metabolic heat. A basket containing 10 kilograms of apples produced approximately 100 millijoules of thermal energy per hour, slightly raising the temperature inside the pantry and accelerating their own ripening. This process released ethylene, a colorless, sweetish gas that accumulated in the enclosed air, infusing the wooden shelves with an aroma of ripe fruit and concentrated sugar. The pantry was a garden of plant respiration in the darkness. The biological and chemical processes of the night continued without regard for human sleep, marking the hours with their slow, invisible transformations. Other inhabitants of the night. Nightlife within the walls of a medieval castle was not solely the domain of humans. The fortress was a shared ecosystem where numerous animal species adapted to the darkness and the cold. The presence of rodents was so common that the scratching of their claws on the wooden planks became the unavoidable soundtrack of the early morning hours. A single rat could produce an almost metallic scrape as it gnawed at the edges of chests in search of food. The musky scent they left in their wake permeated the corners, a sensory reminder that the castle was also a habitat for smaller creatures. These small, intermittent noises broke the monotony of the silence, keeping the brain in a state of subtle alertness. The mice nesting inside the straw mattresses generated metabolic heat that altered the bed's temperature. A group of 5 or 6 mice huddled together inside the mattress could raise the local temperature by up to 3 degrees above the ambient temperature. The friction of their bodies against the straw produced a continuous rasping, creaking sound that blended with the sound of the mattress itself. The bats that inhabited the attics and under the slate roofs emerged at dusk, emitting ultrasounds between 40 and 80 kilohertz. These high-frequency waves, inaudible to the human ear, bounced off the tower walls, allowing them to navigate in total darkness. The flapping of their membranes produced an almost imperceptible rustling, a paper-like whisper that broke the stillness of the ceiling. Their presence was a reminder that the fortress, in its upper reaches, belonged entirely to the nocturnal fauna. The bats that lived in the attic beneath the slate roof emitted ultrasound at a frequency of 45 kilohertz. These high-frequency waves bounced off the wooden beams and returned to their ears in about 5 milliseconds, allowing them to calculate the exact distance of obstacles with a margin of error of less than a centimeter. The attic was a space saturated with invisible echoes, a 3-dimensional sound map that only they could decipher. The darkness of the roof was filled with acoustic architecture. The owls that hunted in the outer courtyards did so in near silence, thanks to the structure of their feathers. The edges of their flight feathers were serrated, breaking up air turbulence and eliminating the high-frequency sound normally generated by wing flapping. While mice crunched on the wooden floors, the owl's descent from the battlements was invisible and inaudible, a dark flash that sliced through the air without disturbing the stillness. Its presence was revealed only by the occasional, distant hoot. The call of an owl in the nearby forest filtered through the battlements with an altered acoustic quality. The acoustic impedance of the denser, cold air outside caused the sound waves, at a frequency of approximately 500 Hz, to travel faster and clearer, penetrating the stone walls like a sonic needle. The solitary, rhythmic hooting cut through the silence inside, a reminder that the castle was not alone in the landscape. The forest sent its voice through the stone. The guard dogs that slept at the foot of the beds were not just companions, but a biological early warning system. Their hearing range reached 45,000 Hz, allowing them to detect the rustle of a distant branch or the hooves of a horse several kilometers away. When their ears moved imperceptibly, their nervous system was processing frequencies inaudible to humans, translating them into a soft whine or a change in posture. They were the fortress's living radars. Their silent restlessness was the first line of defense against the outside world. The hunting dog sleeping at the foot of the bed generated an amount of metabolic heat proportional to its body mass. A 30-kilogram hound produced approximately 100 watts of thermal energy at rest, heat that was transferred to the stone floor through direct contact with its body. This transfer created a localized zone of warmth that raised the floor temperature within a half-meter radius, a hot spot that quickly dissipated into the cold air of the chamber. The animal was a living furnace of blood and fur, heating the rock. The castle cats, silent guardians of the pantries, possessed a reflective layer behind the retina called the tapetum lucidum. This structure multiplied the available light by a factor of 200. Composed of riboflavin and zinc, it allowed them to see in lighting conditions as low as 1 lux, equivalent to the light of a crescent moon. Their eyes shone in the darkness with a greenish glimmer that appeared and disappeared among the shadows of the beams, 2 points of light that moved soundlessly. The cat was a phantom of reflections that patrolled the fortress with phosphorescent eyes. The claws of a cat walking on the stone slab floor produced a sound of a specific frequency that betrayed its position in the darkness. Each claw, upon touching the polished granite surface, generated a high-pitched tap of approximately 2 kilohertz, a rhythmic chittering of chitin on mineral that repeated with each step. This sound, barely audible during the day, became clear and pinpointable in the silence of the early morning. The cat traced its way on the acoustic map of the stone. The orbiting web-building spiders took advantage of the night's stillness to weave their structures in the corners of the beams. The spider silk, 5 times stronger than steel of the same diameter, stretched between the wood and stone, vibrating at a frequency of hundreds of hertz as it captured the flight of a moth. The radial geometry of the web trapped the suspended dust motes, becoming visible in the moonlight. It was an invisible feat of engineering that flourished in the darkness. The cobwebs hanging from the corners of the ceiling acted as extremely sensitive vibration sensors. A common spider web, with threads about 3 micrometers in diameter, could detect vibrations as small as 1,000th of a millimeter, translating the passage of an insect 2 meters away into a perceptible oscillation. In the moonlight, these silk threads shimmered like silver filaments, vibrating with every draft that crossed the room. The movement of a solitary spider across the granite wall generated an almost imperceptible vibration in the stillness of the room. Each of the spider's legs, exerting a force of barely a few dynes, produced a dry, rustling sound that the acoustics of the bare stone amplified into a tiny echo. The fortress's dovecote, built atop one of the secondary towers, housed dozens of pigeons that returned at dusk with a dull, rasping sound of their wings. These birds, equipped with a magnetoreceptor in their upper beaks, oriented themselves using the Earth's magnetic field of approximately 50 microteslas, finding their way back even in total darkness. As they landed in their mud and straw nests, the flapping of their wings transformed into a deep cooing of about 300 hertz that vibrated through the wooden roof structure. The dovecote was a resonating chamber of feathers and magnetism. The pigeons, sleeping in the tower's dovecote, generated metabolic heat that accumulated inside their nests. Each pigeon, with a body temperature of around 40 degrees Celsius, contributed to raising the nest's temperature above that of the outside air, creating a microclimate of humid heat that escaped through the dovecote's entrance as steam visible at dawn. The scent of warm down and acidic droppings mingled with the tower's cool air. The bees that inhabited the apiaries in the outer courtyard huddled together inside the hives, forming a compact ball that maintained a core temperature of approximately 35 degrees Celsius. The bees outside, exposed to the night's chill, vibrated their thoracic muscles at a frequency of approximately 250 Hz, generating heat that was distributed throughout the colony. This collective hum, barely audible through the straw and mud walls of the hive, was a vibrant vibration of life pulsating in the frosty courtyard. The bees slept shivering, generating their own sun with the movement of their wings. In the outer courtyard, the night's dampness awakened creatures of almost imperceptible movement that left a physical trace on the stone. The slugs that inhabited the damp corners of the walls moved at a speed of approximately 1 millimeter per second, secreting a highly viscous mucus that reduced friction with the rough rock. This layer of slime, rich in protein and water, dried at dawn, leaving a silvery trail that glittered in the first rays of sunlight. The pantries adjoining the kitchens harbored a microscopic ecology of grain moths and beetles. The insects fed on the stores of wheat and barley, and the sound of their mandibles chewing the dry grain created a rhythmic rustling at 35 degrees Celsius. This organic rustling, amplified by the silence of the castle, seeped through the door jambs. It was the sound of the pantry being devoured in the gloom, a tiny, ceaseless feast. The weevils that inhabited the sacks of grain in the pantry produced a collective sound that intensified with the stillness of the night. Each weevil, as it pierced the husk of the wheat grain with its mandibles, generated a crackling sound of approximately 40 decibels, which, multiplied by hundreds of individuals, created a continuous, low-frequency murmur that seeped through the pantry walls. This sound, similar to sand slowly falling, was the noise of food decomposing in the darkness. The grain devoured itself in a feast of invisible mandibles. A solitary fly trapped inside the chamber after nightfall instinctively sought refuge in the window panes or the slits of the shutters. Its flight, disoriented by the absence of sunlight, became erratic, colliding with the glass with a buzzing sound of varying frequency, oscillating between 200 and 300 Hz. The water drawn from the inner well at midnight maintained a constant temperature of around 12 degrees Celsius, regardless of the season. This occurred because the well drew its water from underground aquifers protected by meters of rock, insulated from winter frosts. Drinking from the porous clay jug brought with it a mineral freshness, a taste of damp stone and deep earth. The contrast between the cold water and the dry air of the room immediately awakened the senses. This water was the only living element flowing in the stillness. The water stored in the porous clay jugs underwent evaporative cooling, which, on winter nights, formed a thin layer of ice on their surface. The clay, by allowing the water to seep through and evaporate on the outside of the jug, reduced the temperature of the liquid inside to freezing point. Breaking that thin layer of ice to drink from it, produced a sharp crack and an icy contact that lowered body temperature. The external cold held sway over the water. Lowering a wooden bucket attached to a hemp rope into the inner well produced an echo that revealed the geological depth of the fortress. The bucket's impact with the water's surface, some 15 meters below the surface, generated a low-frequency sound that ascended through the cylindrical stone conduit, amplified by the damp walls. The splash reached the surface with a delay of almost a tenth of a second, a liquid echo that measured the distance between the castle and the underground aquifer. The well returned the sound of the water like the earth's heartbeat. The courtyard's inner well possessed its own resonant frequency, determined by the depth of its air column and the cylindrical shape of the conduit. A voice or an echo falling into it amplified the sound waves of around 200 hertz, returning a deep, watery murmur. The stagnant water at the bottom acted as a perfect sound reflector, creating an underground echo chamber. The lime mortar that bound the enormous stone blocks was not an inert material, but a chemical entity that breathed with the night. As the relative humidity increased, the slaked lime slowly reacted with the carbon dioxide in the air in a process called carbonation. This reaction released an earthy, alkaline aroma, a smell of damp stone dust that emanated from the joints of the walls. The fortress, in its innermost structure, was being built and solidifying while everyone slept. The slaked lime on the interior walls, reacting with the carbon dioxide exhaled by the sleeper, slowly transformed into calcium carbonate in a process that consumed the air breathed. Each exhalation, laden with approximately 4% carbon dioxide, fueled the carbonation reaction that hardened the lime layer, turning human breath into solid mineral. The wall grew with the breath of the inhabitants, transforming that breath into stone. The iron plate armor left on guard in a corner underwent a profound condensation process as the temperature dropped. Upon reaching the dew point, the water vapor in the air condensed onto the cold metal, coating the plates with a thin layer of moisture. This physical transformation of the metal evidenced the midnight temperature drop. The sword blades and chainmail leaning against the walls underwent a process of accelerated condensation and oxidation during the early morning hours. As the temperature dropped below the dew point, water vapor condensed on the cold steel, forming an invisible liquid film. This thin layer of moisture reacted with the iron in an electrochemical process, creating rust in a matter of hours if it was not oiled. The metallic, earthy smell permeated the room, a stark reminder of the metal's fragility. The oxidation of the iron railings in the nighttime humidity was a silent electrochemical process that altered the metal's color. Oxygen in the air, in the presence of water vapor, reacted with the iron, forming hydrated iron oxide, a reddish compound that crumbled away as a fine powder when touched. Moisture from the ground rose up the limestone walls through a physical process known as capillarity. Microscopic pores in the rock acted like tubes less than a millimeter in diameter, allowing groundwater to climb against gravity at a rate of about a centimeter per hour. This water dissolved minerals in the stone and, as it evaporated from the wall's surface, left a white trail of crystallized salts that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. The castle drank from the earth as it slept. The efflorescence of salts on the limestone walls created a white pattern that grew in the darkness. Groundwater rising by capillary action dissolved the salts in the mortar, and as it evaporated on the wall's surface, it left behind crystals of calcium sulfate that formed sharp structures. The wall bled salt, drawing dry stone maps. The erosion of the limestone walls released a constant rain of fine calcium carbonate dust. The friction of the wind and the temperature changes microscopically crumbled the surface of the walls, creating a mist of white particles that settled on the furniture and tapestries. The castle was slowly dissolving, grain by grain. The water in the moat surrounding the fortress had a thermal stratification that altered its acoustic behavior at night. The surface layer, in contact with the frigid air, dropped to about 4 degrees Celsius, while the bottom, protected by the water, remained at 8 degrees. This difference in density created a barrier that reflected the sounds falling into the moat, returning a muffled, watery echo that seemed to rise from the depths. The moat was a mirror of water and temperature that reflected the sounds of the castle back with a muddy voice. The water in the courtyard fountain froze on the surface during the coldest nights, forming a layer of ice, the thickness of which depended on the time of exposure. At temperatures of -5 degrees Celsius, a layer of ice approximately 2 millimeters thick formed in 6 hours, enough to alter the sound of the water as it broke under the fountain's pressure. The cracking of the ice was a sharp, brief sound, like thin glass shattering. The fountain sang with an icy voice, like glass breaking in the darkness. The underground cellars, excavated beneath the tower, offered an acoustic and thermal landscape completely opposite to the rest of the fortress. At a depth of 5 meters, the temperature remained stable at around 10 degrees Celsius, and the brick vaults amplified the sound of the dripping oak barrels. The slow fermentation of the wine released carbon dioxide, creating a dense, slightly effervescent atmosphere that muffled the bass sounds. The creaking of the expanding wood of the barrels was the only pulse of that subterranean space. The depths held silence and time in their liquid form. The wooden barrels in the underground cellar harbored colonies of mold that thrived in the darkness. At a relative humidity of 90%, the fungi decomposed the cellulose in the oak wood, releasing carbon dioxide and an earthy, musty odor that saturated the subterranean air. The creaking of the staves as they expanded in the humidity was the only sound accompanying this slow decomposition process. The cellar was a laboratory of silent decay, fire, and its risks. The fear of fire was a constant shadow that dictated strict nightly routines in a medieval castle. Because much of the upper floors and roofs were made of dry wood, a single lapse in attention could consume an entire tower in less than 2 hours. Therefore, a designated marshal was responsible for extinguishing all torches and braziers before midnight, leaving only carefully controlled embers. The moment the last light went out, plunged the fortress into a total sensory abyss. The resulting darkness was not merely a lack of light, but a measure of collective survival. The smoke from the pine or pitch torches did not dissipate easily, but rather accumulated in the stone vaults, forming a dense layer of soot and gases. The incomplete combustion of the resinous wood released carbon particles that remained suspended in the air, reducing visibility and giving the atmosphere a pungent odor. Breathing in the room meant inhaling traces of tar and ash, an aroma that permeated woolen clothing and hair. As the hours passed, this grayish fog slowly descended to the floor. The embers that remained in the hearth after the flames died down changed color with their temperature, shifting from a bright orange to a deep cherry red. These embers, which hovered around 600 degrees Celsius at their core, emitted infrared radiation that reached a radius of barely 1.5 meters. Beyond that perimeter, the cold regained its absolute dominance. The sight of those incandescent points in the gloom was a spectacle of pure physics, a dying pulse of heat in an ocean of cold. The last ember remaining in the hearth, a fragment of oak barely 2 centimeters in diameter, reached its final point of extinction when its internal temperature dropped below 200 degrees Celsius. At that moment, combustion ceased, and the carbon stopped reacting with oxygen, leaving a black core of charcoal that preserved the cellular structure of the original wood. That fragment was a fossil of fire, the last thermal memory of the heat that had sustained life in the chamber during the hours of wakefulness. The burning embers in a poorly ventilated space produced an invisible, silent gas that altered the air quality in the room. Carbon monoxide, a result of the incomplete combustion of oak wood, accumulated in the upper layers of the warm air rising toward the vaulted ceiling. At concentrations of barely 100 parts per million, this gas induced a deep lethargy and a subtle headache that many mistook for natural sleep. The chimney, without proper draft, was a slow poison that lulled one to sleep without warning. The smoke that could not escape through the chimney in the main hall became densely stratified in the cold air. As the carbon particles cooled, they lost their buoyancy and descended in horizontal layers, creating a grayish fog that hung at chest height. The smoke, overcome by the cold, formed an invisible ceiling at floor level. The iron poker by the fireplace was a perfect thermal conductor, becoming an extension of the dying embers. With a thermal conductivity of around 80 watts per meter Kelvin, the metal absorbed the residual heat from the coals and dissipated it into the cold air of the room. It was an object of extreme contrasts, a rod of pure physics waiting in the gloom. The iron chains that held the iron cauldrons, suspended over the fire, stretched in the heat and contracted in the cold, altering the cauldron's height throughout the night. As the embers died down, the iron chains contracted at about 1.5 millimeters per meter, raising the cauldron a few centimeters above the ashes. This barely perceptible movement produced a metallic squeal that lasted several seconds and resonated throughout the chimney structure. The cauldron rose and fell with the heat like an iron elevator driven by thermodynamics. The ash accumulated in the hearth was not an inert residue, but a highly reactive alkaline powder. Composed largely of potassium carbonate, the ash absorbed moisture from the air and released a dry, caustic odor that permeated the base of the chimney. If accidentally stepped on, it would raise a cloud of fine particles that remained suspended in the still air for minutes. This white powder coated the edges of the stone, a sterile layer that recalled the long-extinguished fire. The wine spilled on the oak table during dinner did not evaporate quickly in the cool air. Instead, it seeped into the wood grain. Alcohol, with a higher vapor pressure than water, evaporated first, leaving a sugary, acidic residue that slowly crystallized at low temperatures. This process released a sweet, vinegary aroma that mingled with the scent of old wood, creating a lingering olfactory layer that dominated the center of the room. The table held the memory of the banquet in the form of sugar crystals. The bottom fermented beer stored in the castle's cellars continued its maturation process overnight at a stable temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. The sedentary yeasts that settled at the bottom of the barrels consumed the residual sugars at a rate of approximately half a gram per liter per day, releasing tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide that rattled the wooden walls of the cask with a muffled chime. This sound, inaudible from more than a meter away, was the heartbeat of fermentation, a yeast heart thumping in the darkness of the cellar. The tallow and wood ash soap, left next to the basin of water, hardened considerably overnight due to the crystallization of fatty acids at low temperatures. As the temperature dropped below 15 degrees Celsius, the stearin in the tallow became rigid and brittle, losing its ability to lather and acquiring a waxy, cold feel. This physical change made the soap seem like just another stone in the fortress, a mineral object that only regained its usefulness with the warmth of hands. Cleanliness itself froze in the gloom. The leftover bread from dinner underwent a physical process called starch retrogradation. As the temperature dropped overnight, the starch molecules recrystallized, expelling the water trapped during baking and hardening the crumb. This process made the crust brittle and the interior dense, changing the aroma from sweet to a more earthy and dry smell. The previous night's bread became like edible stone under the effect of the night's cold. Honey stored in earthenware jars in the winter pantry underwent a crystallization process that altered its texture and color. At temperatures below 14 degrees Celsius, the glucose in the honey began to form crystallization nuclei that expanded at a rate of approximately 1 millimeter per day, transforming the golden liquid into an opaque, granular mass. This process released a small amount of latent heat, raising the temperature inside the jar by fractions of a degree. The honey solidified in the dark, becoming edible crystal that glowed milky white at dawn. Dried pears stored in esparto grass baskets released crystallized sugars that glittered in the moonlight. The fruit's dehydration had concentrated the fructose to a saturation level, which, with the night's chill, formed sugar crystals on the surface of the wrinkled skin. These crystals, less than a millimeter in size, reflected the moonlight with a golden glimmer, transforming the basket into a tiny treasure chest of edible jewels. A burning ember exploding in the hearth did so with a force determined by the thermal expansion of the water trapped inside. Oak wood, even after hours of burning, retained pockets of liquid water within its cells. When heated above 100 degrees Celsius, this water instantly vaporized, multiplying its volume 1,700-fold and fracturing the ember with a sharp crack that projected incandescent fragments up to half a meter away. Each explosion was a microcosm of pressure and vapor that illuminated the darkness for an instant. The beeswax dripping from the extinguished candles did not solidify immediately, but rather underwent a gradual cooling process that altered its molecular structure. As the temperature dropped below 62 degrees Celsius, the wax's esters began to crystallize, releasing a sweet, warm aroma that wafted through the room like a sigh. This fragrance, composed of volatile fatty acids, was denser than the surrounding air and settled in the lower layers of the room, creating a sticky, golden atmosphere that enveloped the wooden furniture. The leather of the boots and gloves left by the fire underwent a dehydration process that altered its flexibility. Vegetable tanned leather, treated with oak tannins, lost up to 10% of its water content at temperatures near 30 degrees Celsius close to the embers, becoming rigid and brittle. As it cooled overnight, the leather contracted, emitting a dry crack similar to a branch breaking. The footwear hardened in the cold, a reminder that animal hide still responds to the laws of moisture. Wine served in ashwood glasses lost some of its volatile aroma through absorption into the glass walls. Ashwood, with its open porosity that allowed liquids to penetrate to a depth of 2 millimeters, absorbed the wine's fruity esters, reducing the aroma's intensity by approximately 15% compared to a metal glass. The next day, the empty glass released a scent of ink and fermented grapes that intensified with the warmth of the hands. The wood absorbed the wine's flavor and stored it in its pores like a liquid memory. The private chamber. The doors to the private chambers were not simple wooden planks, but solid oak barriers reinforced with wrought iron bands. A 5-centimeter thick oak leaf offered remarkable thermal resistance, but its true function was acoustic. When closed, the iron bolts slid shut with a deep click that resonated in the stone frame, sealing the room with a definitive sound. The weight of that wood, which could exceed 150 kilos, transformed the act of isolating the room into a tangible physical effort. This closing marked the beginning of voluntary confinement. The contact between the stone door frame and the oak door created an acoustic discontinuity that reflected some of the sound back into the room. The difference in density between granite at 2.7 grams per cc and oak at 0.7 grams per cc caused the sound waves to bounce off the boundary between the two materials. This phenomenon prevented low-frequency sounds from escaping the room, amplifying them inside as if it were a resonating chamber. The door was an invisible wall to low-frequency vibrations. Wrought iron lock mechanisms required constant maintenance to withstand the nighttime cold. The animal fat used to lubricate the bolts thickened at low temperatures, increasing friction and causing the mechanism to jam. To prevent this, the grease was mixed with graphite powder, a solid lubricant that allowed the metal to slide even below freezing. The click of a key turning in the lock was a sound of precise engineering in the middle of the night. The wrought iron keys that unlocked the doors to the private chambers changed their acoustic tone with the temperature. As the iron contracted in the cold, its density and natural resonant frequency shifted, making the sound of the key striking the lock higher pitched at 3 in the morning than at dusk. This variation in tone, of approximately a quarter of a tone, was barely perceptible, but created a sense of unease in anyone manipulating the lock in the dark. The metal sang a different note depending on the time of night. The sound insulation provided by the thick walls created a bubble of absolute solitude. This architecturally induced deafness made the isolation feel like a physical layer, separating the individual from the rest of the known world. The solitude was not only emotional, but an acoustic reality, where the only truly close sound was one's own heartbeat. The tapestries hanging on the walls were not mere decorative elements, but rather primitive insulation engineering. A fabric woven with heavy wool and gold threads could absorb up to 30% of the acoustic reverberation from the stone, muffling the echoes of the fortress. Furthermore, they created a thermal barrier that prevented the cold from the walls from radiating directly into the center of the room. Beneath those woven figures of forests and battles, the room became a cocoon of fabric. Silence and warmth were trapped within the interwoven fibers. The iron rods that held the tapestries to the chamber walls rusted unevenly during the early morning hours. The side of the rod in contact with the cold stone wall, more exposed to condensation, rusted 3 times faster than the outer side, creating an uneven layer of oxide that selectively weakened the metal structure. The heavy wool curtains hanging from the bed's canopy not only blocked drafts, but also created a microclimate of trapped air. The wool fabric, with a thermal conductivity of a mere 40 milliwatts per meter Kelvin, acted as a barrier, retaining body heat within a volume of approximately 2 cubic meters. Inside this textile cocoon, the temperature could be 6 degrees higher than that of the room, creating an abrupt sensory contrast upon waking. The canopy was a room within a room, a fabric refuge within the stone fortress. The sleeper's breathing within the fabric canopy created a microclimate of water vapor that condensed on the cooler surfaces. Each exhalation, laden with moisture at a temperature of 32 degrees, raised the relative humidity inside the canopy to 95%, forming microdroplets of water on the wool of the curtains. The body's breath became a mist in the darkness of the bed. Bear or wolf hides spread on the stone floor beside the bed created a surprisingly effective thermal barrier. The animal hide, with its layer of residual subcutaneous fat and dense network of hair follicles, trapped a layer of air approximately 2 centimeters thick between the fibers, reducing heat transfer to the stone to less than 10% of the normal flow. The wooden shutters that sealed the windows were not static structures but living barriers that responded to nighttime humidity. The fibers of the oak or chestnut wood absorbed water vapor from the air, expanding and hermetically sealing the gaps through which the wind seeped. This natural swelling, which could increase the wood's volume by 2%, made the shutters perfect stoppers. The occasional creaking of the expanding wood was the sound of the final seal against the outside. The condensation that formed on the inner surface of the closed wooden shutters dripped slowly onto the stone sill. The water vapor produced by the sleeper's breath, upon striking the cool wood facing outwards, condensed into droplets approximately 2 millimeters in diameter that collected on the lower edge of the shutter before falling onto the stone with a high-pitched thud. The sleeper's breath solidified into water that dripped onto the stone. The parchments and manuscripts left on the reading table underwent a physical transformation overnight. The vellum, made from calfskin treated with lime, absorbed moisture from the air and rippled slightly, emitting a rustling sound of animal fibers tensing in the darkness. The iron and oak gall ink, a deep bluish black, reacted to the humidity, slowly oxidizing and changing hue in the candlelight. The pages came alive, breathing with the castle. The goose quills used for writing had a hollow structure that made them extremely sensitive to changes in humidity. During the night, the quill's keratin absorbed water vapor from the air, softening and losing its structural rigidity. By dawn, the quill left on the table felt soft and flexible, unable to draw a precise line on the parchment. The writing instrument succumbed to the humidity before the writer himself. The red wax seals that secured the documents on the reading table retained their shape thanks to the chemical stability of rosin, a plant resin mixed with iron pigment. At temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, the seal wax became extremely brittle, losing its elasticity and cracking with a fine, crystalline sound when accidentally pressed. The pine chests that held the bed linens underwent a cycle of expansion and contraction that made them noisy in the early morning hours. Pine, with its higher porosity than oak, absorbed water vapor until it reached a moisture content of 18%, swelling its fibers and straining the joints. As the temperature and relative humidity dropped, the wood contracted, emitting a dry, brief cracking sound that repeated at irregular intervals. The chests breathed like resinous lungs. The cowhide belt left on the table next to the basin absorbed the ambient humidity with an eagerness that altered its physical shape. The collagen fibers of the vegetable-tanned leather, capturing water vapor from an environment with over 80% relative humidity, expanded lengthwise to 2% of their original length. The leather breathed and stretched in the dimness of the table. The goatskin wineskin containing the drinking water hardened considerably during the early morning hours due to the crystallization of residual lipids in the leather fibers. The drinking vessel transformed into a percussion instrument when the cold tightened it. The end of the night. The end of the solitary night did not arrive with light, but with a physical phenomenon of thermal expansion. The first rays of sunlight struck the eastern wall of the fortress, heating the stone's surface so rapidly that it created a temperature gradient of several degrees between the exterior and interior. This temperature difference caused the granite to expand microscopically, emitting a deep, collective crack that resonated across the entire facade. It was the moment when the architecture stretched its mineral muscles. The fortress awoke, bidding farewell to the night with the creaking of the rock. The first ray of sunlight to strike the stone of the keep was invisible to the human eye, belonging instead to the ultraviolet spectrum. This radiation, with a wavelength of approximately 300 nanometers, reached the atmosphere before visible light due to the refraction of the air layer at dawn. Though invisible, this radiation initiated a photochemical reaction on the surface of the limestone, breaking down the organic compounds accumulated during the night and preparing the rock for the heat cycle that would follow. Dawn over the fortress was not an instant, but a physical process lasting approximately 40 minutes from the first glimmer of light until the full solar disk appeared on the horizon. During this interval, the temperature of the stone on the eastern facade rose at a rate of 1 degree per minute, causing thermal expansion that generated a cascade of acoustic cracks reverberating up and down the wall. The castle opened its stone eyes and welcomed the day with the same sound with which it had bid farewell to the darkness. The castle's geographical orientation determined the sequence of the dawn sounds. An east-facing fortress received the first rays of sunlight on its keep at a speed of approximately 1,600 kilometers per hour, the Earth's rotation at the latitude of Central Europe. This front of light and heat advanced across the facade at a visible speed, warming the stone at a rate of 1 degree per minute and causing a cascade of thermal crackles that traveled up the wall. Dawn was a wave of sound that swept across the stone from east to west. As night drew to a close, the faintest stars began to fade, not from lack of light, but from atmospheric scattering. The cold, early morning air, dense and laden with suspended frost particles, scattered the light from the faintest stars, reducing the visible field of the sky. The celestial vault lost its infinite depth, becoming less absolute black, closer to dark blue. This change in the quality of the darkness heralded the slow awakening of the horizon. The last star to disappear before dawn was not the faintest, but the one closest to the eastern horizon. This star, lost in the twilight's glow, ceased to be visible when the sunlight scattered in the atmosphere reached an intensity of approximately 10 lux, a threshold that erased the stars one by one, in reverse order of their brightness. Its disappearance was the definitive end of night, the moment when the sky ceased to be a map of luminous points and became a blue veil covering the fortress. The last sound of the night was not silence, but the dawn chorus of birds, which began about an hour before sunrise. Thrushes and robins, whose vocal cords resonated at frequencies between 2,000 and 8,000 hertz, began their songs in a precise order dictated by the intensity of the light. The first to sing was always the robin, capable of perceiving light levels as low as 1 lux, followed by the thrushes 10 minutes later. This ascending chorus, which entered through the arrow slits like a tide of feathers and frequencies, was the biological clock announcing the end of the solitary night in the stone fortress. This cessation of the wind before dawn was not merely a silence, but an atmospheric stabilization that altered the acoustics of the landscape. As the air currents stopped, the temperature layers in the atmosphere stabilized, eliminating the conduit effect that amplified distant sounds. The noises of the forest and the river lost their clarity, becoming muffled and distant, while the internal sounds of the castle took center stage. The first acoustic change heralding dawn was not a sound, but the disappearance of one. Approximately an hour before sunlight reached the horizon, the nighttime temperature inversion that had amplified distant sounds began to dissipate. The echoes of the forest, which during the early morning had arrived clear and close, slowly faded, returning to their true distance. The silence of the castle changed texture, becoming more opaque and dense. Night departed not with light, but with a different kind of silence. The watermill on the river beside the fortress produced a low-frequency seismic vibration that resonated through the rocky ground. The wooden wheel, turning at about 6 revolutions per minute under the weight of the water, generated a rhythmic pulse of approximately 0.1 hertz that traveled through the bedrock to the castle's foundations. This vibration, imperceptible to the ear but palpable underfoot on the stone floor, was the mechanical heartbeat of the landscape. The castle rested upon the river's pulse. The millstone that ground the grain for the morning's bread produced a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the castle's foundations. The 2 granite millstones, each weighing approximately 500 kilograms, rotated at 60 revolutions per minute, generating a seismic pulse of about 5 hertz that traveled through the bedrock to the fortress walls. This vibration, imperceptible to the ear but tangible as a tremor in objects placed on the stone, was the heartbeat of the industry that prepared the day's sustenance. The mill spoke to the earth before the first ray of sunlight touched the stone. The cooling of the keep followed a pattern of thermal inertia that delayed the extreme cold. The mass of stone, with a specific heat of approximately 800 joules per kilogram, took up to 6 hours to lose the heat absorbed during the day, meaning that the peak of cold inside was reached just before dawn. The stone released its heat, slowly and agonizingly. The fortress cooled with the slowness of geology. The night sky above the fortress was not a passive roof, but a heat sink that silently extracted heat from the stone. The celestial vault, at an effective temperature of approximately -270 degrees Celsius, radiated infrared radiation toward the Earth with an intensity that cooled exposed surfaces several degrees below the surrounding air temperature. This phenomenon, called downward atmospheric radiation, caused the tops of the battlements to become covered in frost even on nights when the air temperature did not fall below 2 degrees Celsius. The stone faced upward and lost its heat to the vacuum of space, a silent exchange between the Earth's rock and the cosmic cold. The still water of the moat reflected the starlight with a fidelity that depended on the tranquility of its surface. On a windless night, the layer of water became an almost perfect mirror, reflecting the Milky Way with a resolution that allowed individual stars to be distinguished in the dark water. This inverted image of the sky, visible from the battlements, created the illusion that the fortress floated above the cosmos, suspended between two identical starlit skies. The terracotta tiles covering the castle's outbuildings were so porous that they acted like sponges, absorbing nighttime moisture. The clay, with an open porosity of up to 15% of its volume, absorbed the dew that condensed on its surface during the early morning hours, darkening the tile's color from terracotta red to a deep brown. At dawn, evaporation restored the tiles to their original hue in a process that lasted approximately 2 hours. The roof changed color with the night, becoming coated in moisture like a mud chameleon. The terracotta floors of the kitchens possessed a heat capacity that made them a slow-release thermal accumulator. During the day, the clay absorbed the heat from the ovens, raising its internal temperature to 40 degrees Celsius, and during the night, it released this energy gradually, at a rate of approximately half a degree per hour. This phenomenon created a zone of residual warmth in the center of the room, a thermal oasis that shrank as dawn approached. The peregrine falcon, confined in the kennels of the West Tower, slept with only one cerebral hemisphere active, a state called unihemispheric sleep that allowed it to keep one eye open and oriented toward the window slit. Its retina, endowed with approximately 1 million photoreceptors per square millimeter, was capable of detecting the movement of a rodent in the starlight, a sensitivity that transformed its open eye into a passive sensor, effortlessly monitoring the darkness. The bird slept, gazing at the night with a phosphorescent eye, a feathered guardian patrolling the void with its very biology. The stone handrail of the spiral staircase, worn smooth by the touch of thousands of hands over the years, had a polished surface that altered its thermal behavior. The polished stone, with a higher albedo than the unpolished stone, radiated less heat to the hand that touched it, creating a sensation of less cold compared to the rough stone of the walls. Centuries of wear had polished the stone until it was more attuned to the cold. The medicinal herbs hanging from the rafters lost their aromatic potency at a rate dependent on the temperature and humidity. Dried rosemary at a relative humidity above 70% released its essential oils slowly, concentrating its aroma in the lower levels of the room. At dawn, as the temperature rose and the humidity fell, the release of volatile compounds accelerated, producing an olfactory explosion that filled the room with the scent of pine and dry earth. The herbs lay dormant, concentrated, and awoke in a breath of plant chemistry. The stones of the main hall's ribbed vault, carved with millimeter precision and joined by lime mortar, formed a structural system that redistributed itself under thermal loads. Each voussoir, contracting in the cold, transferred a fraction of its weight to the adjacent stones, creating a cascade of microscopic adjustments that propagated throughout the vault over several minutes. This readjustment produced a chorus of subtle clicks that swept across the ceiling like a wave of moving stone. The vault breathed its geometry into the darkness, redistributing centuries of weight with every degree of cold. we have spent an entire night inside a stone fortress. From the first candle lit to the last ray of light that struck the keep, the castle breathed, contracted, creaked, and sang with the voice of 1,000 materials responding to the laws of physics in the darkness. Wax solidified into fiery clocks, iron aligned itself with magnetic north, lime transformed breath into mineral, and the well water held the geological memory of centuries of rain filtered through the rock. Each detail was a fragment of a night that belongs not to fiction, but to the most tangible and intimate reality of matter. The calcium atoms that form the stone of those walls are the same calcium atoms that travel through the human bloodstream, supporting the structure of bones. The iron that rusted in the hinges of those doors contains the same element that carries oxygen in the blood. The carbon that solidified in the last ember is the same carbon exhaled with every breath, the same carbon that formed the stars billions of years ago before there was earth or castle or night. This exploration is not about some distant place in time. It is about the same atoms, arranged differently, dancing with the same physical laws that govern the silence of a room. The history of a medieval night is the history of matter interacting with the cold and the dark. It is a record of thermal expansion, acoustic reverberation, and slow chemical decay. The fortress was a living organism built from the earth, subject to the same physical forces that shape the stars and the seasons. Thank you for exploring this history. If you would like to see more, you can watch the next chapter now.